G'day guys, what's going on? Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Lindie Botes. Now, Lindie is a polyglot. I would be comfortable calling her a polyglot. She speaks several languages and is currently learning Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. So she is a native English speaker and also a native Afrikaans speaker. She's from South Africa. But I've been following her on YouTube for a while now, and she gives a lot of tips on learning languages, and I thought that I would get her on the podcast, pick her brains, and ask what it's like learning some of the most difficult languages for an English speaker to learn, including Korean, Chinese, and Japanese. So hopefully, guys, if you guys are native Asian language speakers, right, if you speak Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Thai, hopefully you'll be able to see what things are like from the other side of the glass, I guess. You know, she's looking through one window from English to your languages, and I know that you guys need to learn English from those languages. So hopefully there's some good content in here for you guys that will help you, give you motivation and tips on learning a foreign language when it is very, very difficult. Anyway, thanks for joining me today, guys. I give you Lindie Botes. G'day guys, welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today I have Lindie Botes on the podcast. I hope I said that correctly.
It's Botes.
Botes, sorry. So, man, I've followed you for a while on YouTube, obviously secretly in the shadows without really, sort of reaching out. And I decided to finally bite the bullet and I was like, look, I like this chick. I want to get her on the podcast to talk about her experience learning languages. Man, can you tell me your story, Lindie? How on earth did you end up now learning, I think, at least as far as I'm aware, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese, right? All simultaneously as well. So can you tell us your story?
Sure. So my dad's a diplomat. So growing up, I lived in a bunch of different countries. Not any of those languages you mentioned. So I haven't even set foot in China or I haven't lived in Korea. But grew up in a bit of time in Paris, Pakistan, Dubai, and some significant time in Japan. So I think growing up, I was always exposed to different languages and cultures. And I never really took language learning seriously. For me, it was more just a subject at school. So I did Arabic and French at school. And then when we moved back to South Africa after 5 years in Dubai, my mom saw an ad in the newspaper for free Korean lessons. And I had a few Korean friends in Dubai. And my mom said, "You want to try this?" I was like, "Oh, okay, why not?" And it was like completely no reason. I mean, I know a lot of people get into Korean through K-pop and K-dramas, which is awesome. But back then it was, I think, 2009. And, the Korean wave hadn't really hit so much in South Africa. So I just started for the fun, no real reason. And the more I studied Korean, the more I fell in love with the language. And I started seeing connections between Korean and Japanese. And a lot of Korean singers often release music in Japanese. So there were these connections I kept seeing. I'm like, maybe I should try Japanese. So I dabbled in that for a little bit, not very seriously, until my parents heard they're moving to Japan in 2013. And I was like, well, now I better learn. My dad is very cute and competitive. And he's like, we should do a challenge and see who can learn Japanese the fastest. So he never actually knows where he's going to be posted to. So before he knew it was Japan, he's like, whatever country it is, you and I should both learn the language as a challenge. I'm like, she's going to accept it. Then we heard it's Japan, and my dad's like, oh man.
To talk about going from easy to this is the hardest language probably for an English speaker to learn.
Yeah. So I guess it just kind of flowed naturally from there. And then Mandarin Chinese, I just got an interest. Before I started learning Japanese, I actually just wanted to dabble in a new language. And my Chinese is actually the weakest of the three. But now I'm based in Singapore and I hear it on a daily basis. So it's about time I start brushing it up.
And so how did the challenge go?
Well, my dad failed miserably. I'm only joking. There's this weird thing between my dad and my mom. Every country we've lived in, one of them either does the language really well and the other one does it really bad. So my dad is great in French and Urdu, and my mom is awesome in Arabic and Japanese.
Wow.
And then it's kind of the opposite. So
well, it's probably the best way to be, though, right? To sort of complement each other, as opposed to be, banal at all of them, right? Or
good point.
What was that like then? Moving, was it sort of as good as it was frustrating, because at the same time you're learning languages in certain countries and then all of a sudden you sort of get uprooted and then plonked in a new country and you're kind of like, oh, I've just mastered this language, or I've just gotten to a good level, now I have to start again, like, damn it.
Yeah, so I actually didn't live in Japan per se. I just visited my parents every university holiday. So over the span of 4 years, I lived in Japan for 1 year, 1.5 years.
Okay.
So I actually found it a great opportunity, not kind of bothering my language learning of other languages. And I did my internships there, so it was really great exposure to the language. And interestingly enough, I have been learning Korean for about 12 years now, 11 years.
Yep.
And Japanese only since 2013. And the speed it took me to reach a conversational natural level in Korean was a lot longer than it took me to reach natural level in Japanese. And that is totally because of the exposure of the language 2 to 3 times a year, like really concentrated, which I didn't have with Korean.
Did you find the grammar too? I know very little about either language, but I from what I'm aware, the two languages have grammar that's similar, at least compared to English. Did that give you a bit of a boost as well, where you were like, okay, Korean, my Korean has gotten me in that headspace of this is how the grammar works, and so I just need to learn the words and pronunciation a bit more in Japanese?
Yes. Korean and Japanese grammar are almost identical.
Oh, wow.
And I found it actually more effective to learn Japanese using Korean resources, so textbooks for Korean people learning Japanese, because I was already in that mind frame. Like, if the sentence structure is exactly the same, the time it takes to process in my head is a lot shorter than it would be if I was learning through an English.
Got you. That's it. I have very limited, basic fluency in French and now much more advanced in Portuguese. And ironically, it was the opposite way a few years ago. But I married a Brazilian, and so we've been speaking it like crazy for the last year, just at home, always in Portuguese. But I found that the grammar that I had learned in French really set me up to sort of dominate in Portuguese compared to someone learning a language for the first time and it being Portuguese, because it's so sort of similar. But
these are interesting.
Yeah, well, at least in structure, French I think has the grammar's a little bit more complicated, I would say, depending on which aspects you're looking at. But yeah, I really liked Portuguese, and it's interesting that you say that you would prefer to use a language that you sort of know less proficiently than English, but if it has a similar grammar, it's going to shortcut, learning those patterns. So which other languages do you speak as well? And could you tell us a bit about each level in each language? Because I know that there are a lot of polyglots out there, and I don't know if you use this label or not, but a lot of people who are self-professed polyglots. And I feel, at least from my point of view, from learning a few languages to, conversational level, at first you see these people and you're like, holy shit, they speak 16 languages like native speakers. Like, how the hell would I ever do this? And then once you start learning a language, you realize, wait a second, there's no way that they speak these like a native speaker. And you kind of get demystified a bit. So what has it been like for you? And to what level have you gotten each language, and what has that journey been like?
Yeah, I mean, fluency is so hard to define. And I've had a lot of people, like if I'm on articles or podcasts, people are like, Lindie is fluent in whatever languages. And I want to be like, no, I'm not. New people. Oh my goodness. People always introduce me as, this is the girl who speaks 8 languages. I'm like, no, I really don't. I'm just learning things. Like, still my home language. My home language is Afrikaans. I'm still learning things every day. Yeah. And I'm sure you would know as well as any other person that, I mean, when can you actually call yourself fluent? That's really hard to answer.
And again, as you say, it so depends on what you mean. Like, I use that, I kind of divide it into fluent as in I can have a conversation with someone who doesn't speak English and we can communicate, right? And I can pretty much talk about basic stuff. I'm going to make lots of mistakes, but I'm not proficient in the language, meaning I would consider that much more close to native level, right? Where you are, I could give a speech spontaneously in front of a bunch of people, or I can answer, I could, do an interview in the language comfortably. I feel like that is a completely different story, right?
Mm-hmm. So I guess my list would be, native Afrikaans speaker, but I've always gone to English school, so I consider myself pretty bilingual, and it's actually easier for me to communicate in English if I'm talking about technical things.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the language I feel most like emotionally attached to is Korean. So there's a video of mine that went viral on YouTube where I woke up from anesthesia speaking Korean.
I've heard of people doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know how to explain that because I got the operation in South Africa. The doctors were Afrikaans, whatever, and then I wake up and the first language I speak is Korean. So that I think what that means to me is it's my emotional language, and
that's crazy.
I find that with the grammar in Korean, you can express a lot of emotions verbally more than you can in English. In English, we would use intonation, like I'm so tired. Whereas in Korean, there might be a grammar structure to emphasize that. So especially when you're typing, there's no miscommunication because your grammar, it can inflect how you're feeling emotionally.
So whereas we would have to obviously use a lot more emoticons or like emojis with lots of smiley faces or frowny faces to show, no, I'm joking, or no, exactly. I'm sad.
Right. And then after that, I would say Japanese is my most fluent after Korean. And then maybe Mandarin Chinese and French. I have learned French since second grade at school, but it's gotten very, very rusty because I don't use it. And I spend so much time on Asian languages.
And that's what I feel I get frustrated about too with some of the polyglots that I see, because they'll say, oh, I'm fluent in these languages. I haven't spoken this one in 6 years or whatever. And you're just like, how have you maintained the fluency, right? Because I found as soon as I started giving all my attention to Portuguese, my French plummeted with regards to speaking abilities. I can hear and watch things and it kind of, I get it, but to formulate a sentence, Portuguese always inserts itself in there wherever I can't find the words.
Yeah, we're the same there, yeah. So I would say I have like semi-fluent understanding. I can listen to a podcast or the news in French, but when I need to speak, I sort of stutter a little or I use very basic sentences. But someone can speak back to me and I'll understand them.
Yeah.
And then, for the rest, it's just languages I've been dabbling in. So a bit of Vietnamese, Hungarian, Arabic, Urdu. I recently started Tagalog, Filipino, and mostly Southeast Asian languages, kind of just dabbling in them a little, but it's not enough to.
That's pretty interesting though, right? Because I think most polyglots, or most people who are interested in, most language learning enthusiasts, so I'll use that instead of polyglot, most language learners tend to go for languages that are closer to their mother tongue, right, first. What made you decide to sort of completely jump ship and, just go off into the horizon in a very, very far off destination into Japanese, Korean, and Chinese? Because that must have been so much harder, right? And how did you stay motivated when you were doing that? Because it must have been so much more difficult to get those early gains, right?
Yeah, I think I didn't have any intrinsic motivation to learn European or African languages at first because I've always been interested in Asian culture.
Yeah.
So growing up surrounded by Korean people at school or, Chinese supermarkets around me, like always fascinated by the characters. I'm especially interested in learning languages with a different script. So Chinese characters, Japanese, Korean, Thai. So those have always fascinated me. And I think that acts as the motivation because there's a sense of fascination. It's not, I have to learn this for school or let me learn this. Like so many people have told me, you should learn Dutch because you speak Afrikaans. It would be so easy.
I freaking hate that. I was told so many times as well, people would be like, learn Chinese. It's the most, spoken language after English, or has the most number of native speakers. And I'll be like, I don't know that many Chinese people. I don't know that much about the culture. Like, I can't just sort of just completely, it's like saying you like exercise, do ballet. It's like, I'm not interested.
Exactly.
I don't know. Maybe in the future, but currently.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've never had the desire to learn Dutch, not because I'm not interested in Dutch culture, but I've always had this fascination with Asia. And I can understand Dutch totally fine. You can speak to me in Dutch and I will reply in Afrikaans and we can have a conversation. For me right now, that is enough. Like, I don't feel, especially given my living circumstances, all my friends are, Asian. I live in an Asian country. Right now, learning something like Dutch would not benefit me as much as, the new language I've started, Tagalog, which I hear Tagalog around me every single day. Like,
and that's the thing too, right? Utility. If it's not useful to you in the moment, it's kind of like, okay, I'll watch all these YouTube videos about how to run a marathon, but I can't go outside. It's like, well, when are you actually going to be able to put it into practice and go out there and do that thing? Like, I started Portuguese because I started doing jiu-jitsu, and all of a sudden I went from being surrounded by English speakers to being surrounded by Brazilians who are always speaking Portuguese. And I was like, I want to communicate with you guys. And so it is so funny how it becomes, like, at least for English speakers who have the sort of, I guess you can indulge your sort of language learning interests as opposed to foreign speakers who are like, I have to learn English because business, because communication in foreign countries.
True.
What do you do if you tomorrow, if someone, picked you up, plonked you in Holland and said, you're going to be living here for 5 years, what would be your plan for learning Dutch? How would you conquer that language as fast as possible? Because I'm sure a lot of listeners here are sort of probably plateauing at a plateaued level in English where they've reached, intermediate to advanced and they don't know what to do now. What would you do if you were having to learn a language again?
Very interesting. I think with the question you framed, like if somebody plonks me there and I have to start living there, obviously I'm going to be an expat in Holland. And I think a lot of expats tend to move within their own communities. So living in an expat area and going to an English supermarket and going to expat, it's like I would avoid that completely because I want to get as much immersion as possible with the local people or the native people. Of course, for me, starting language, the most important thing is listening and hearing, because the more you hear a language, the easier it is to copy the correct pronunciation. And if your pronunciation is correct, you sound more fluent than you even are, and that also boosts your confidence to keep going. As you know, like how babies learn a language, they don't sit with a textbook, right? They just hear their parents and they repeat. So I always tune my ears to something. Something I like doing here is listening to the subway announcements in different languages. So in Singapore, it's in Mandarin, English, Tamil, and Malay.
Wow.
I'm just trying to listen to it over and over and over. And the number for the police here is 999. So them saying that in different languages, you'll hear one word being repeated 3 times and you're like, oh, okay, that must be the number for 9. And that's how you learn. You just pick up on these little things, keep hearing, and then try and reproduce it. Obviously, you also need material, so I'd get myself a textbook. I am a solid believer in, sure, there are great apps, you can learn from the internet, but me as a visual learner as well, I like to have a book by me to track my progress. I like highlighting and writing as much as I can. And everything I do in a language, I want to try and do everything I do normally, I want to try and do in my target language. So if I'm setting up a shopping list, I would write that in my target language, especially if you're shopping in a different country and everything on the shelves are in that language. Might as well learn the word for it, write it in your shopping list,
Well, that's one of those things that I find that a lot of people ask me about. They come to Australia and they end up in their communities with people who speak their language. They end up operating in their own language. They move in with people. They're watching TV. They're listening to podcasts. They're doing everything in their own language. And I'm trying to tell them constantly, you need to spend more time in English, as much of your day in English as possible. Even if you aren't surrounded by English speakers, watch English TV, listen to podcasts, read books, but you need to shift yourself out of your own language because those two are going to be competing, right?
Yeah.
And have you found that has helped you advance a lot faster when you put those sort of practices into place?
Yeah. The more exposure you get, the easier it is. And it's so hard to explain. So I'm someone who likes listening to a lot of music, and I memorize the lyrics, but sometimes I won't know what the word is in the language.
Yeah.
And then I'll just sort of casually be studying a language, and I'll come back to the song like a month or 2 later, and I'll be like, oh my goodness, I understand this. And a lot of it is just passive learning. A lot of it is also learning in context. You don't need to look up every single word. You'll eventually figure out what it means just by hearing it so much. Yeah,
I had that recently. I've been watching on Netflix a TV series called The Mechanism, which is a Brazilian TV series about corruption. And they keep having in brackets, like it's obviously for deaf people. So they keep putting up in brackets like coughing or sneezing. And I kept seeing this one, and I realized that it was every time he cleared his voice or cleared his throat, he was doing and they had the same, I think it was offerganchi, and it was the same word kept coming up, and I was like, finally, I remember this goddamn word after I've seen it probably 20 times. So,
and you didn't need to look it up. You
exactly. And it was, I love learning in that sense because you get to see the you have the context. You hear what the guy's doing. You can see what he's doing. You can see the word. Do you think that you should use subtitles when watching that sort of stuff, or do you recommend not using subtitles too? Because I know that's a contentious issue, but I love using them.
Like, if using subtitles, if you're struggling to understand something, why remove the convenience and the entertainment? by removing subtitles. Sometimes, at the end of a long day and if my brain is really tired, I would watch a Korean drama with subtitles just for those few words that I might know. But I think turning off subtitles does help your brain tune into it a bit more and watch a lot more actively. But it depends on your levels. I would say subtitles for beginners to intermediate, and then upper intermediate to advanced. If you feel like turning it off, by all means.
Yeah, exactly. And what do you find it's like with memory? Because I get a lot of people, and this happened to me with French and Portuguese when I started sort of taking it seriously. I was always frustrated at how easily I forgot things. And every time you see people who have learnt the language and speak it really well, you're like, oh man, they just must be really natural at this. They must just get grammar. They must just have a really good memory. I don't think that's the case, but what do you think? Is it a kind of thing where it's just you pick it up over time, or you have to have a good memory?
Very, very good question. I'm going to not go down the saying that memory is the key to learning language. A lot of people say, oh, I'm over 25 years old, my brain isn't tuned into learning. No, it takes time and effort and dedication and repetition. You got to hear something, read something, use something all the time. It doesn't help if you have a good memory because it's going to stay in your short-term memory. So, gosh, I'm sure studies have been done on this, but from my experience, learning a language is not something that happens overnight. I wouldn't say I have a talent for learning languages. Maybe I have a skill set that teaches me how to learn a language effectively. I wouldn't say I have this inborn talent that all of a sudden I'm amazing in all these languages. No, it takes me hours of practice and dedication. I would say where the talent comes in is in how you learn the language, how smartly you study, not how good your memory is.
So what would be some of the things you would say people don't do this? This is going to waste thousands of hours, of potential time you could spend doing something useful. What are the lessons you've learned going through this about things you shouldn't do?
Don't memorize vocabulary lists. I think people are super... Like, at the beginning of a language, when you're very excited, you'll look up, 100 most common words in this language, and you'll sit and memorize them all. By all means, great, but for me, it's more memorizing them in context. So in the context of a sentence. And a lot of those word lists are alphabetical, and you'll get them starting with, being an interjection. The first word is, you'll pick that up from speaking. You don't need to sit and memorize that one. And then the next word will be apple. And then the next one is avalanche. You don't need to know that. So maybe if you do have a list of the most common words, sit and highlight the ones you think you would use in daily conversation the most. And then get a website or a friend or an app where you can get example sentences with that word in it. Write down the sentence. And then what I like to do is replace the words in the sentence with other words. So if I've learned a new noun, I'll take that noun out and replace it with a ton of other nouns. And then I'll be learning new words and a sentence structure at the same time.
Yeah, so that's it. I mean, that's one of those things. I'm always just you just have to keep seeing the thing again, and eventually you will remember it if it's important, right? Because the brain is all about remembering what you need to use. And so remembering words that are useless isn't really going to help you. And I also say, how often do you forget a word in your own language, right? I forget words in English all the time, and I've been speaking English for 32 years,
Yeah, it's because you don't use it on a daily basis. Yeah, and this thing you were saying about just using it all the time, I think a lot of outdated ways of language learning these days is going to a lesson or a class 1 or 2 days a week. And then what people tend to do is after that lesson is over, they'll go home and they will forget about language until the night before when they do their homework, and then they go back to the class. That is such an ineffective way of learning because you're only blocking out 2 hours a week for the language instead of trying to integrate it in every way possible.
And that's part of the problem though, right? Where people think that teachers need to teach them a language, whereas teachers need to be there to sort of inspire you to teach yourself the language, right?
Totally.
So what do you think of language classes? If you were learning a new language, say Dutch, would you bother going and enrolling in a school, or do you think it's much more effective to be your own teacher and do it yourself?
I'm in two minds about about this question. So, when I was in middle school, I took some lessons at the Alliance Française for extra French,
I did that
and
too.
I found that was extremely. Oh, did you? Yeah, I found it was extremely beneficial because the teacher only spoke French. Like I
Yep.
did not hear a word of English in her lessons, and wow, that was just so great because you're forced to try and understand through context. So in that case, like if your teacher is only speaking that language, by all means, that's such a good way. But something my dad really struggled with when he was learning Japanese was his teacher barely spoke Japanese, and they spent more of the lesson discussing culture and or focusing on one sentence and really trying to break down the grammar. When, I mean, why do you learn a language? The point is to be conversational, not to understand the grammar in depth.
Well,
So I'm
that's
all
it,
for
right?
having language lessons if your educator is suited to your needs.
Yeah, well, that was it. I was terrible at French in school, even though I'd studied it for 6 years. I mean, for 6 years of investment, you would imagine you would get to a level that you could, survive on your own in the country. And I didn't feel like that at all.
Yeah.
And I think so much of it was just, it was like you were not following a direction that interested you. You just had to go wherever the class went, which tended to be random every single week.
Right.
And so you had no direction. And
True.
then it was funny because I fell in love with French again 10 years later and got to a really good level within a few months of sort of reigniting that flame, but following my own interests, like reading Harry Potter and watching TV shows that I enjoyed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what else was I going to ask? What was it like learning some of these languages when you compared your idea of the language or the culture before learning it to once you had learnt it? Because I found for Portuguese, at least, I remember before I started learning the language, I thought, oh, this language is really ugly. It sounds really strange. They make all these weird noises, like emphasize weird things. Like, I remember hearing the word também, and being like, oh, why do they do that? It's so weird. That, também. But then after I'd gotten to basic fluency in it, I was like, my God, I love this language now. It's so emotive when they speak and it's kind of very singy up and down. And it was just really funny once you started understanding people and not hearing the sounds, right? So what was it like with Korean, Chinese, and Japanese?
Wow. So for Korean, I didn't actually enter with any expectations or preconceived notions at all. So it was completely new. And apart from Urdu and Arabic, the first language I learned was a completely different script. So at the beginning, I struggled a bit with some new sounds that we don't have in English or Afrikaans. So Korean has both an O sound and an O sound.
Yep.
And they're romanized as O and EO, respectively. So that took me about 2 years to be able to properly pronounce O. So that was tricky, and I didn't expect that. But I think Korean set the base for learning other Asian languages. So far there haven't been any surprises. Hungarian was extremely difficult in terms of grammar. And I didn't have so many good resources, and I started by learning from a friend on Skype, and he would just sort of say random sentences and I'd write them down, but it was very hard to decipher the grammar. So I think maybe having started on a different way, like a lot more basic approach, would have been better instead of just diving into full sentences.
Interesting. And what about Basque? Would you ever dive in and learn that? I've heard that's one of the most complicated ones with grammar.
Really? I actually don't know much about Basque. Wow, personally, I'm not too interested in languages from the European region. So I'm going to have to say no.
Yeah. So I guess that's about all I wanted to harass you about. But what about pronunciation? Before we finish up, how did you go about learning the pronunciation of these different languages? Was there a certain way in which you practiced them, or went about it? Did you use the IPA? Did you do it passively?
Yeah, I actually didn't use the IPA, and I think that would have been quite beneficial, but I was too lazy to learn it. So for me, it was more just listening and repeating I've always been good at copying accents and, for fun, in school plays or with my brothers, copying an Indian accent or an Irish accent or a French accent. And what really helps is if you're learning Korean, for example, think of how Korean people stereotypically would speak English. And not to make fun of them, but then try and look at the intonation that they place on words. And then when you're trying to speak Korean, kind of put yourself in the mind frame of being that person.
Yep.
Another thing I like to do is to visually draw what the word or the sentence sounds like. So, for example, Vietnamese has a different intonation from English. So, Ban Cai Yi means what do you need in Vietnamese, whereas in English would be like, what do you need? Or what do you need?
Yeah.
Right? Whereas music, it goes up in the middle. So drawing like little graphs for myself helps a lot. There's a YouTuber I like, his name is Dogen. He's makes funny Japanese videos about the language. And one of his newest videos, he kind of makes a joke about how people generally say Japanese is a very flat language, but then when you say the word flat in Japanese, that word itself is not flat at all. And he kind of draws it out in this video. And then he's like, Nihongo wa furatto desu. And people are like, furatto. No, furatto. Like your voice goes up. So, checking out his videos is pretty funny.
I'll have to get a link from you and chuck that in the transcript.
For me, it's more copying people, really listening to the intonation and saying it over and over. For me, it's a bit tedious to be watching a drama or listening to talks and pausing it and recording myself.
Yeah.
But that's always an option if you have a lot of time.
Awesome. Well, last question. What advice would you have for people who are from Asia, who have, whether they speak Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, or Japanese, now that you're sort of into the culture and you understand the languages, what would you give them as advice for learning English?
I think there's a very big mental block towards English. Speaking specifically from the Korean and Japanese perspective, there's so much emphasis on trying to get fluent in English, and people are very easily swayed by learn English in 30 days or 5,000 business English words. And the English exams in Korea and Japan are so difficult. It's this very complex piece of writing that you need to try and fill in the missing word or try and decipher what the main point of that is. I think that's such a bad approach to learning a language because you're never going to speak it like that. So my advice would be to learn from the people around you, like who you interact with the most, not to sit in front of your desk and try and memorize like 3 months to a language or 5,000 most common words. Rather go out, have a drink with some friends, and even if you're too shy to speak, keep listening, because the more you hear it, the easier it'll get.
I think that's a good piece of advice, because I think that's one of those things that a lot of people end up focusing too much on improving areas of English they're not using, right? Like if you learn all this business English, but you're not actually using the words when you speak English most of the time, which might be in informal, casual situations with your friends, what the hell are you doing, right? You need to be practicing that stuff. And I noticed that with Kel, my wife, and Portuguese here at home, because I'm very, 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 very fluent at the stuff we talk about in the house, because we're always talking about it. And it's the most useful stuff for me because we always talk about it. But it's funny, I noticed that when she brings friends over, my fluency can drop sometimes to effectively 0, depending on the topics that they suddenly want to talk about, because it's not something I have use for on a daily basis, although it's fun to try and navigate those conversations. Anyway, Lindie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find out more about you?
Cool. Thanks so much for having me. So I have a YouTube channel. You can just type in Lindie Botes. So that's LINDIE BOTES. And you can also find me on Instagram, which is just at Lindie Botes, or Twitter at Lindie BE, like Lindie B.
No worries. I'll put all the links in the transcript so people can find your stuff. And I definitely recommend checking out these videos if you want some motivation, because I know that learning those Southeast Asian languages or Asian languages is very difficult for English speakers, which means obviously English is very difficult for Japanese speakers. Anyway, Lindie, thank you so much again. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.